Imagine stepping into a country that's been ripped apart by war for over a century. Just constant fighting, chaos everywhere, powerful warlords grabbing land, cities burning, people just trying to survive.
It sounds absolutely brutal.
Yeah. What happens when, out of that turmoil, some incredibly determined, even brutal figures emerge and decide they're going to force this place into peace? How do they even do it?
Right, and what kind of society do they build to keep that peace going? I mean, for literally hundreds of years.
Exactly. And what eventually brings it all crashing down, that's the powerful story we're diving into today. Early modern Japan, roughly from the mid-1500s to the mid-1800s.
And to explore this fascinating period, we're really digging deep into one specific, incredibly rich source. Excerpts from Konrad Topman's detailed book, Early Modern Japan, 1568-1868.
Right. And this book, it's not just a dry list of facts, is it?
No, not at all. Topman treats it like a roadmap. It gives you insights not just about the key players and political moves, but also about, the everyday lives of people and even the fundamental ways they interacted with their environment. It's quite holistic.
Absolutely. So our mission in this deep dive is to navigate Topman's material, pulling out the most important nuggets to really understand this transformation.
Yeah.
We want to grasp how Japan was unified after all that chaos.
How the resulting peace was successfully maintained for over 200 years. That's just mind-boggling.
It really is. And the complex internal challenges that system created or faced, and ultimately what led to its dramatic end.
So we'll be looking at the political structures that held it together, the economic forces at play, that incredible burst of cultural creativity, and even the surprising ways environmental factors shaped this history. It's all interconnected.
It really is. So get ready for a journey into a truly pivotal time, one that created the foundations for modern Japan, and perhaps offers some surprising lessons for us today about how societies build stability, grapple with internal pressures, and ultimately adapt, or fail to adapt, to a changing world.
Let's unpack this incredible transformation.
All right, let's kick things off by setting the scene. Japan before 1568. Topman paints a vivid picture, doesn't he? He describes a century of nearly incessant and widespread warfare, starting way back in 1467.
Yeah, and it wasn't just occasional battles. The text really emphasizes this was a time of endemic warfare. Basically, the traditional political authority had just fallen apart.
Fallen apart how?
Well, the old system, based on military setups, tax collection, a shared ideology, it crumbled back in the 15th century. The leaders lost control over the ideas that held things together and, crucially, their income. Money and belief, gone.
And into that power vacuum stepped these regional warlords. The source calls them usurping barons, just constantly battling.
Right. There's this great quote from a European observer, Valignano, around 1600, just as things were maybe starting to shift. He said Japan was divided up among so many usurping barons that there are always wars among them, each one trying to grab for himself as much territory as he can.
Wow. Just pure self-interest in fighting.
Pretty much. Power was totally fragmented, held by these individual daimyo. But, and this is a crucial point Topman makes, it wasn't like society just vanished.
All right.
Even before the century of war, centuries of earlier change had already built a large, complex, and expanding society. There were rich political and cultural traditions, and an economy that was actually experiencing considerable growth.
Ah, okay. So the ground wasn't completely bare when unification started. The leaders who emerged, they could draw on that existing foundation.
Exactly. Topman notes that the process of reunification, or pacification as he calls it, involved combining new forms of organization with older elements of the political and cultural legacies. They weren't starting from scratch.
And key part of that legacy came from the warlords themselves, the survivors.
Yes, the Sengoku daimyo. The source argues they demonstrated unusual competence as a lord, basically. Proving they could manage their own patch during the wars became the practical basis for them claiming the right to rule on a bigger stage. They showed they could get stuff done.
Okay, so who are these figures who actually started the process? The source points pretty clearly to Oda Nobunaga, starting after 1568 as the real pioneer.
Right. And interestingly, it says he didn't bother with claiming old titles like shogun or emperor at first. His claim was purely military.
Just brute force.
Essentially, his armies could pound rivals into submission, and importantly, the areas he pacified stayed that way. He brought stability, albeit through overwhelming force. He was incredibly pragmatic.
And ruthless, you said. The text mentions he saw himself as engaged in handling public affairs, Kogani. What's the significance of that?
Well, it suggests maybe a vision beyond just personal gain, even if his methods were brutal. It hints at an idea of public good, however imposed, and this raw will to succeed. It wasn't just on the battlefield.
Right, it extended to civil projects too. The source gives that fascinating example from a Jesuit account in 1569 building a castle in Kyoto.
Oh, yeah, that's amazing. He ordered temples just crazed to take over a massive site 4 streets long and wide. That tells you a lot about his attitude to establish power right there.
Totally. And the scale, 15,000 to 25,000 workers daily.
And it wasn't just peasants. The source says princes and nobles were forced to do manual labor. Talk about turning the hierarchy upside down. It's a visual statement.
And he builds it out of stone, which was unusual.
Yeah, entirely of stone, which Topman notes was pretty uncommon for castles there at the time. And if they needed material, he ordered stone idols like religious figures pulled down and dragged to the site.
Literally tying ropes around their necks. That's
It's,
intense.
it's incredibly potent imagery, isn't it? Shows his ambition, his willingness to break any norm, and he's there supervising directly, carrying a sword or baton, always pushing.
And this forcefulness definitely extended to brutal actions against enemies. The source highlights the Enrakuji incident, right? The monastery on Mount Hai.
Yes, in 1571, this monastery had a history of political meddling and, crucially, had allied with the Nobunaga's enemies. So, once he dealt with them,
He turned on the monastery.
big time,
Yeah.
deployed 30,000 men,
Yeah.
systematically burned around 300 buildings, libraries, treasures, everything.
And then the really chilling part.
Yeah. The source adds he ordered the slaughtering the survivors, some 3,000 men, women, and children, indiscriminate, horrifying.
It shows the extreme measures taken of just eliminating opposition completely.
Yeah.
It really underscores how the brutality of that warring period was kind of weaponized for unification.
Absolutely. Events like Enrakuji reveal the harsh reality of how those first steps towards peace were actually achieved.
Okay, shifting gears slightly from pure military might. The source also touches on the economy during this pacification phase, late 16th century. It seems leaders like Nobunaga and Hideyoshi used economic resources for their military campaigns.
But that, in turn, actually spurred economic expansion, almost like a militarized stimulus package, you know?
Interesting. And by the early 17th century, this economic opportunity started working for the peacekeepers.
Exactly. It provided jobs, prospects. People were less desperate, less likely to resort to violence just to get by. Prosperity itself became a tool for stability.
What about money? The source mentions currency issues. Good coinage was scarce.
Yeah, because trade had been so disrupted during the wars, people hoarded good coins, making them expensive.
So what do they do?
Well, Nobunaga tried to standardize values in his area around 1569. Hideyoshi minted some coins. But Topman says effective nationwide reform only really happened after Hideyoshi died.
So precious metals were still key.
Oh, yeah. Heavily used for foreign trade, political gifts, decoration, though their use in actual coinage did gradually increase over time.
And Tallman brings in the environment here, too, reminding us this whole process wasn't just about people and armies.
Right. He talks about the ceaseless interplay of people and their environmental context. Farmlands, forests, the sea, they all played a role.
You can't really separate them.
Exactly. The source stresses that to really get what was happening, you need to look beyond just the human records and consider these fundamental environmental interactions. It's a much more complete picture.
Which makes total sense. You can't build an empire or fight wars if the land doesn't support you. That brings us nicely into part 2. The establishment of the Tokugawa peace in the early 17th century, building on Nobunaga and Hideyoshi's groundwork.
Yeah, this new era really solidified after Tokugawa Ieyasu's big win at the Battle of Sekigahara in 1600. And within about 50 years of Nobunaga starting his rise, the efforts of these leaders had created, as the source puts it, a political structure of unprecedented magnitude and coercive power.
That's a huge shift from Valignano's description of fragmented barons just a few decades earlier.
Massive. And there's that striking quote from the English merchant Richard Cox in 1620. He called the Japanese government the greatest and powerful less tyranny, the most powerful tyranny he'd ever encountered.
Wow. What did he mean by that?
Well, he elaborated, saying everyone else was basically as slaves to the emperor, or great commander as they call him, meaning the shogun. He was clearly stunned by the shogun's absolute authority.
Able to order powerful daimyo to commit ritual suicide.
Yeah, just by sending a letter, or face the complete annihilation of their entire race, their lineage. That's a fundamentally different kind of power than Valignano saw.
The contrast is really stark. So the political structure that emerged,
Yeah.
the source uses words like feudal or federal.
Right. It assigned enduring power and essentially autonomous administrative authority to daimyo. So the daimyo weren't wiped out, but their power was now contained within this larger Tokugawa framework.
So the challenge became keeping the peace across all these semi-autonomous domains.
Precisely. How do you make that stick?
How did the daimyo manage their domains under this new peace? The source says they established routines of peaceful governance even while readying for war, a balancing act.
Definitely. They had to administer effectively day to day, but the potential for conflict or the need to project strength was always there, and many daimyo were actually transferred to totally new domains after Sekigahara.
Like carpetbaggers, the source calls them, strangers arriving often to hostile locals.
Exactly. And they had to figure out how to settle their own samurai retainers, too. It wasn't easy. The source gives the example of Yamanouchi Kazutoyo in Tosa, 1601. He inherited a population of farmer warriors who really resented him.
And his first job was basically, don't screw up.
Pretty much placate them, or Ieyasu might punish him severely, take away his domain, his rank, maybe his life. Plus, he had to settle his own guys and set up a tax system.
A tax system that could fund everything, officials, troops, a castle, levies for the shogunate, without provoking a revolt.
Yeah, a constant juggling act. It shows the pressure these daimyos are under.
And these daimyo headquarters, they evolved into castle towns, jokomachi. These became really important centers.
Absolutely. Kanazawa in the Maeda domain is the example used. Vassals moved outside the castle walls for space, but their houses were still arranged defensively.
And they dug canals, 15 kilometers worth.
Yeah, for defense and water supply. They even moved temples and shrines around to organize the city better and integrate them into the defensive plan.
Smart. Specific areas were set aside for merchants and commoners too. And all this construction, it provided work.
Significant work. Not just unskilled labor, but jobs for skilled artisans, loggers, carpenters, masons, building the infrastructure of peace, you could say.
Beyond just the physical stuff, daimyo issued codes for vassals, rules for townsmen. They saw cultural regulation as part of the task.
Right. It wasn't separate from governing. They wanted to shape behavior. Kanazawa again gives a specific example with public entertainment.
Kabuki performances were causing fights.
Yeah, leading to bans on traveling troops in 1611, 1612. Ban eased, trouble came back. So by the 1620s, the daimyo just shut down the local theater and bathhouses entirely, punished wrongdoers harshly.
The result.
Well, according to the source, kabuki and puppet troops basically stopped visiting. Prostitution was driven underground. City culture became much more orderly, focused on official holidays and festivals. Shows the level of social control they were aiming for.
What about looking outwards? Foreign relations and trade in this early Tokugawa period.
Trade with Korea and the Ryukyu Islands continued. It brought in good income for the domains of Tsushima and Satsuma. And Ieyasu sanctioned this, basically using it to claim all trade happened under Tokugawa authority, even at the edges.
And then the Europeans. The Portuguese merchant Jorge Alvarez arrived near Kagoshima way back in 1546. He was struck by Japan's biological richness.
Yeah, he noted lots of trees, familiar fruits and vegetables, but what really seemed to impress him was the intensity of the farming.
He said they planted 3 crops a year.
3 crops: wheat or barley or turnips in November, corn or beans in March, rice or yams or garlic in July. Incredibly productive.
How did they manage that?
He observed they fertilized each time with horse manure and dug with spades. Only left the land fallow 1 year after that intense cycle. It points to really sophisticated agriculture already being practiced.
Then the Dutch arrived later, shipwrecked in 1600. And from them, Ieyasu learned something important.
Yes, that not all European traders would insist on bringing missionaries along. Big difference from the Portuguese and Spanish. He didn't act right away, but he kept them around, saw potential use for them.
And the Dutch were happy to help push out the Portuguese.
Oh, yeah. The source says they lobbied fiercely, constantly warning the Japanese about missionary dangers. They even used their ships to intercept Portuguese vessels.
And they brought intel, too, warning about Japanese sailors causing trouble overseas.
Right, maybe trying to make the Portuguese look bad, disruptive. So because of all this fear of missionaries, rival traders lobbying, the desire for control foreign trade started getting restricted from the 1630s.
And by the early 18th century, the policy wasn't just containment, but actively reducing trade.
Exactly, tightening the screws.
Before we move on, Topman keeps bringing us back to the environment. He notes Japan's geology specifically, the lack of widespread glaciation led to more regular river systems in the lowlands.
And that had a huge impact. It fostered uniformity in land use specifically, widespread irrigated rice culture. And the village social structures needed to manage those irrigation systems.
Right, and past ice ages lowering sea levels connected Japan to the mainland.
Yeah, periodically, which allowed Japan to share in East Asia's extraordinary vegetational wealth.
How rich are we talking?
Well, the source gives numbers. Western Europe has about 80 native tree species. North America, maybe 250. East Asia, including Japan, around 500. That's a huge natural resource base to draw on.
It's amazing how deep history, like ice ages, shaped the possibilities for society much later. So, early 17th century, the Tokugawa peace is established, daimyo are integrated. Let's move into part 3, mid-17th to early 18th century. The system matures, but stresses start showing up.
Right. According to the source, pacification changes gears here. It moves out of that initial violent military phase of Nobunaga and Ieyasu.
Into a more administrative phase.
Exactly, a largely nonviolent phase of political manipulation and management. The goal shifts from conquest to control, stability, administration.
And a major focus of this control was the village level. Topman describes this ideal vision, villages as self-sustaining collectivities of smallholders clearly separated from merchants.
Yeah, focused on farming. Villagers were supposed to avoid luxury, work hard, produce food, pay taxes, and look out for each other. Mutual responsibility was key.
Formalized through the gonigumi,
Yeah.
the 5 household units.
Exactly. Based on old Chinese models, groups of households collectively responsible for everyone in the group.
And this was overseen by a strict hierarchy, all the way up from village officials to Edo. The aim was ensuring productive vitality and well-being.
Yes, but primarily productive vitality for the state. Fiscal stability was a constant worry, often tackled through administration. Cadastral surveys, land surveys were crucial.
To figure out taxable output.
Right. And rulers kept resurveying, often tightening methods, which initially boosted income significantly.
But the source notes a change around mid-century. They'd basically recorded most of the good land by then.
Pretty much. Resurveying yielded less and less. Between 1645 and 1697, the reported national grain output only rose about 5.4%.
Which isn't much considering population growth.
Exactly. It suggests that a growing slice of rural production was somehow slipping through the tax net. The fiscal control system wasn't quite keeping up with reality.
Fear of Christianity also remained a big driver of control, didn't it? Temple registration to prove you weren't Christian. That got tighter.
Yeah, tightened in the 1620s. And then in 1640, the third shogun, Iemitsu, set up the Shuman Eretame, a specific board of examiners just to make sure these temple registers were properly kept.
And by the 1660s, this was nationwide. All daimyo had to do it.
Yes, Edo ordered it. Shows how religious control became a fundamental tool of state security, really pervasive.
Individual daimyo also pushed ideological control, like Mitsumasa of Okayama in the 1660s.
Right. He appointed inspectors for heathen Christians, heavily promoted Confucianism in schools, ordered everyone to register at Shinto shrines, and even tore down about half the Buddhist temples in his domain.
Wow, actively shaping the religious landscape.
Definitely. And this period saw scholarship flourish, often focused on practical administrative problems, but also, importantly, justifying Tokugawa rule and samurai privileges.
This led to some interesting intellectual debates within Confucianism. The source mentions Kumazawa Banzan, an Oyome scholar.
Yeah, he was popular, advised Daimyo Mitsumasa, but his idealism clashed with the official shogunal scribe, Hayashi Razan, who pushed the orthodox Chengshu school.
Razan saw him as a threat.
Seems so, and it got political. When followers of a rebel named Yui Shosetsu were arrested, some claimed to be Benzon's followers. Shows how philosophical disagreements could easily become dangerous political entanglements.
Then there was Yamagasoko and his Kogaku school, arguing for reading original texts.
Right. He rejected the later Song and Ming interpretations favored by the official school, and he attacked their practices like quiet sitting as impractical for samurai.
That didn't go down well.
Not with powerful figures like Yamazaki Ansai. At the insistence of Hoshina Masayuki, a very influential figure close to Ansai, the Bakufu exiled Soko in 1665. These were definitely high-stakes intellectual battles.
Okay, turning to culture. Peace and prosperity encouraged arts, but rulers tried to steer it.
Yeah, they tried. The goal was promoting uplifting arts letters, keeping theater discipline containing prostitution, suppressing religions they didn't like.
But did it work?
Not entirely. Despite sumptuary laws and official messages, creativity thrived, especially in the cities. By the end of the 17th century, ukiyo, the floating world culture, really set the urban tone.
What about elite arts? Painting, for instance.
Early on, the Kano school, murals, screens, and Tosa school, book illustration, were dominant. The grand decorative style continued, like with Kano Tanyu. But Topman observes that by the mid-17th century, art became more disciplined, less bold.
A shift in taste.
Seems so. The source says, elegance and dignity have succeeded gorgeousness and boldness, reflecting maybe the ruling class's desire for order, virtue. You even see more paintings of Confucius.
The Katsura Villa is given as an example of this elite taste.
Exactly. Started by Prince Toshihito, finished 1624. A priest's diary describes the pond, islands, artificial hill, summer house. It fell into disrepair.
But got fixed up later with the shogun's help.
Yeah, by his son in the 1640s with Iemitsu's support, added more buildings, landscaping. Topman notes its basic character is still there today, a window into that refined aristocratic world.
Poetry also developed, especially haikai poetry, with Basho. His life tells us something about the period.
Yeah, the source suggests it shows the prestige poets could have, poetry as cultural polish, the way samurai and merchant cultures were mingling, and importantly, the safety of travel that let poets spread their influence.
Haikai became more subtle.
Yes, a complex art form. Basho himself came from a samurai background, but got into haikai through his lord's son. The source mentions the death of both his lord and friend deeply affected him, adding a layer of loss to his later work.
Meanwhile, in the big cities, Kyoto, Osaka, Edo, you have this vibrant ukiyo culture emerging.
Right. Deeply tied to arts, literature, theater, catering to a growing urban crowd, drawing themes from city life, especially the licensed pleasure quarters.
And publishing was key.
Absolutely. Firms churning out handbills, scripts, books, and of course the famous woodblock prints.
Hishikawa Moronobu was mentioned for early prints, flirting lovers.
Yeah, described as lush, boldly executed, capturing that floating world energy.
And in literature, Ihara Saikaku, writing ukiyo zoshi, tales of the floating world.
Exactly. Coming from a merchant background, his work commented on life's difficulties, but apparently without bitterness, capturing the complexity, the moral ambiguity, how social rules cause suffering.
The source mentions a theme in Saikaku Orodome about the difficulty of getting ahead without capital, reflecting economic reality.
Definitely. That filters right into the culture. Later writers like Ejima Kaseki built on his themes, often satirical, but maybe lacked Saikaku's depth, according to Topman.
Theater also boomed. Puppet theater, ninjojori, and kabuki. Chikamatsu Monzamon is the big name.
Huge name. Apparently, when his favorite actor retired, he started writing these dramatic suicide plays for puppets, like Sonozaki, using poetic language, the Michiyuki, to really heighten the tragedy.
He wrote historical plays, too. Didamono.
Yes, his most successful was Kokusenya Kasen, based loosely on Ming resistance to the Manchus. Ran for 17 months, saved the theater.
Wow. And his later plays showed deeper insight.
That's what the source says. Deepening insight into the difficulties of human life. But he had to be careful. After another playwright got censured for a play about the Ako Ronin incident.
The famous 47 Ronin.
Right. Chikamasu apparently heeded the lesson and became more cautious about sensitive topics.
So summarizing this cultural shift, courtly stuff revived in Kyoto, samurai set norms in castle towns, but the dynamic ukiyo culture rose in the big cities, eventually shifting the cultural center from Kyoto to Edo.
That's the picture Topman paints, a really vibrant, complex cultural scene adapting to peace and urban growth.
Okay, let's circle back to the stresses on the system. The environment becomes a bigger issue.
Yeah, the source details how pressures escalated. Long-term overuse, especially in older settled regions like Kenai, made the land vulnerable. Intensive exploitation in the 17th century led to erosion, rivers silting up, more flooding, more drought.
And the authorities noticed. There was that Bakufu directive in 1666.
Yes, specifically banning uprooting vegetation because soil and gravel were washing into streams, messing up water flow. They were clearly aware of the damage.
But the Khan famine in the 1630s, 40s
Yeah.
linked to human activity too, logging and reclamation.
Potentially, yes. New land brought into cultivation was often poor quality, more vulnerable to weather, and less forest cover meant less natural buffering of temperature and water flow.
Combined with a colder climate period and that Yamasi effect in the northeast.
Right, the cold northern air. It all exacerbated conditions, contributed to the famine. It's a clear link Topman draws between land use and climate vulnerability.
And forest depletion had knock-on effects. Higher timber prices, lower quality wood.
Exactly. Price instability, conflicts over forest use, lots of regulations trying to manage forest products.
The Mareki Fire in Edo, 1657, a huge disaster.
Massive. The source calls it a creature of the dry, windy winter. Burned for 3 days, wiped out 60–80% of the city. The main castle keep, 500 samurai mansions, countless commoner blocks. Over 100,000 people killed, maybe 1 in 5 residents.
It's just devastating. And the post-fire policy seems bizarre, banning tile roofs, even for daimyo, leading to flammable thatch roofs.
It looks totally counterintuitive, but Topman suggests it wasn't just irrationality. It was likely forced by a severe timber shortage. They couldn't rebuild the castle keep, let alone provide the massive timbers needed for traditional heavy tile roofs.
Those tile roofs required big timbers, which daimyo used for status display.
Right. So the prohibition, while increasing fire risk long-term, might have been a desperate measure due to immediate timber scarcity. It might have actually consumed more timber over time because of frequent fires needing rebuilding.
A real dilemma. Balancing woodland preservation versus expanding farmland, the source says it was unresolved.
Yeah, policies swung back and forth. They accepted downstream environmental damage as a trade-off for feeding the growing population.
And this ecological stress, early 18th century, coincided with a major demographic shift. Population growth stopped.
Basically, yes. It moved from rapid growth to overall stability.
Not just because of famines, though they cause misery.
No, Topman argues famines don't fully explain it. Preventative checks became crucial. People started having fewer children. Overall, fertility declined in the 18th century, getting close to zero population growth.
Why? What were the factors?
Things like it being harder to get married, women marrying later, which reduced childbearing years, longer gaps between births avoiding pregnancy, plus abortions, stillbirths, and infanticide. Difficult choices driven by circumstances.
And this shift affected where people lived. City populations like Edo weren't self-sustaining.
Right. High death rates, people moving away for work or due to hardship. Edo needed constant immigration just to maintain its size, drawing people seeking work or fleeing famine, especially from the east and northeast.
Okay, so the 18th century.
Hmm?
System looks stable, but underneath, you've got growing environmental, demographic, and fiscal pressures. This takes us into part 4. Mid-18th to early 19th century, deeper challenges, reforms, and more discontent.
Yeah, Topman details how ecological and social stresses really intensified now. With little new land available, the focus shifted to squeezing more out of existing fields, agronomic intensification.
Meaning more work, more fertilizer.
Exactly. Increasing mental attentiveness, labor time, and fertilizer applied to each parcel. This allowed households to survive on smaller plots, leading to smaller farm units worked incredibly intensively by the whole family, wife, kids, siblings, elderly.
And tenant farming grew too, landlords renting out small plots.
Yes, providing a constant labor pool for this intensive work. But the source notes a social cost.
How so?
This focus on intensive family production weakened larger kinship ties and community cooperation. It created a more rigorous, production-oriented village order that rewarded the hardest workers but could push the less fortunate or less capable off their land. Created tension, alienation.
Fertilizer demand surged, not just for food, but commercial crops like cotton, tobacco.
Right. Just as traditional green fertilizer sources, like common lands, were shrinking due to land clearance. So fertilizer got more expensive. Industrial byproducts like soybean waste, Secolis, became important.
Conflicts over common land, Ariachi continued.
Yeah, less land, more pressure. Often ended with the land being divided up among the powerful few. Plus, more river work was needed because of silting from erosion upstream. And bigger river works meant bigger disasters when they failed.
And highway duty got heavier. The Tsukeigo system.
Yes, the burden on assisting villages near highway stations grew dramatically as road use increased, another pressure point on rural communities.
Meanwhile, in the cities, particularly Edo, fiscal and administrative problems mounted. Samurai were deep in debt.
Especially the direct Tokugawa vassals, the Hatamoto and Gokunin, living beyond their hereditary stipends, borrowing heavily from merchants.
Leading to tons of lawsuits.
Floods of them by mid-century. The Bakufu often just order out-of-court settlements, usually favoring the samurai debtors, kicking the can down the road.
And the fire problem in Edo persisted. Still those thatch roofs.
Still a major issue, yeah. A legacy of that post-Mireki fire policy and the timber situation.
So reforms were attempted. Shogun Yoshimune's Kyoho reform, starting 1716.
Right. He tried to tackle the fiscal mess, the debt, the urban problems, administrative changes, fiscal manipulation. But land surveys weren't bringing in much new revenue anymore.
He shifted burdens for things like river repair onto local domains. Kunyaku-bushin.
Yeah, in 1720, limiting bakufu funding, but then created an agency, Fushinyaku, in 1724 to try and tighten shogunal control over those projects anyway.
Tried to control local intendants, Gundai. Centralized tax receipts in Edo.
From 1725. Stopped them deducting their costs first. And to get around hereditary limits on appointments, he created Tashidaka in 1723.
Supplemental stipends for appointing people above their rank.
Exactly. Gave more flexibility based on perceived merit or need rather than just birth rank.
What about economic policy? Price controls, currency reform.
He tried, but apparently abandoned currency reform in 1736. Topman suggests he was swayed by Ojisore's argument that sumptuary laws controlling luxury spending were the key to stable prices, not messing with the coins.
So he went back to debasement, like Ojiwara.
Sort of, but with a twist. Offered a premium for older, more valuable coins when exchanged for new ones. This actually worked for a while.
Oh.
It got the new, debased coins circulating, boosted rice prices, which helped governments and samurai selling tax rice. Bakufu finances recovered, treasury reserves grew for a couple of decades. A temporary fix.
Alongside all this practical stuff, the source details significant intellectual and social ferment. Scholarship got more complex, still justifying the system.
Pretty much. Wrestling with inconsistencies, but still focused on practical solutions and justifying Tokugawa rule and samurai privilege.
In Confucianism, Edo Jinsai's Kigaku school attacked later interpretations, sought truth in original texts.
Right. Prioritizing chi, material force, over principle, criticizing Buddhism and Taoism for abandoning human relations. These scholars gained influence, advising rulers.
It had a really interesting development, challenging the idea that only samurai deserved respect and learning. Arguments for commoner worth.
Yeah, that's a big shift. Nakai Chikuzan at the Kaitokudo Merchant Academy in Osaka is mentioned. He argued all humans have a virtuous essence.
Saw the merchant profession as valid, even virtuous.
Exactly. He argued the profit of merchants is to be seen as a virtue, and saw wealth not as private gain, but as public property circulating. That's radical for the time.
Then Ishida Boeing, founder of Shingaku, from farming, became a merchant clerk, preached to townsmen.
Yes, drawing on various traditions. Promoted meditation, asceticism, and devotion to one's obligations and occupation. Basically, find fulfillment by doing your assigned role well. Authorities liked that because it encouraged social order.
But there were more radical voices. Bundo Shoeki, he denounced almost everyone.
Savagely, according to the source. Scholars, priests, merchants, samurai, the whole ruling order. Only farmers, tillers deserved respect. He saw them as real children of nature, free from greed.
His ideal was the communal village as the entire society.
Yeah, a total rejection of the hierarchical system the shoguns relied on. A real outlier.
Another major current, Kokugaku, national learning. Searching for Japan's unique heritage.
Right. Kamo no Mabuchi celebrated ancient texts like the Manyoshu and Kojiki, saw poetry as having a practical role in recovering ancient virtues.
He attacked the worship of China and Confucianism, but still honored the Tokugawa.
Yeah, credited Ieyasu with restoring Japan's way, but criticized Shinto scholars too for not getting the true ancient spirit, a nuanced position.
Moturi Norinaga is called the most distinguished Kokugaku scholar.
Yes. From a merchant family, became a physician, deeply influenced by Mabuchi. His big idea was the kami, the gods, as the prime mover.
Everything determined by the quietly working will of the kami.
Pretty much, without exception. Limited room for humans, except by understanding the way of the gods through careful study of ancient texts.
Then Hirata Atsutain claimed to be Norinaga's disciple, more adventurous, focused on Shinto and religion over poetry.
Yeah, and his views, perhaps because they address public concerns more directly, became very influential later on, dominating Kokugaku.
Okay, what about European influence? Rangaku, Dutch learning, it started to trickle in more.
Slowly, yes. Early Nanban art had depicted Europeans, but that was suppressed. Yoshimune relaxed the ban on European books, except religious ones.
Driven by curiosity, but sustained by usefulness. Realistic drawing.
Exactly. Illustrated Dutch books influenced painters and stolars from the 1730s. Woodblock artists started using European perspective in inky prints from the 1740s.
Iraga Janai is highlighted. An eclectic scholar. Studied everything.
Seems like it. Minor samurai background, quit his post. Studied European painting, medicine, botany, science, agronomy, economics, plus Chinese-Japanese stuff. Initiated serious study of European painting.
His student, Shiba Kokan, really ran with European style, saw himself as its chief prophet.
Yeah, specialized in landscapes. And he fiercely attacked traditional Japanese and Chinese painting. Claimed they didn't know how to draw Fuji, relied on spirit of the brush, not observation. Very critical of rivals, too.
You also see Bunjin culture emerging, scholars opting out of samurai life for arts.
Right. Pursuing scholarship and arts independently.
Literature saw a shift, too. Takizo Bodkin writing huge historical novels like Nanso Satomi Hakkenden, appealing to samurai readers.
Yes, focusing on heroism, fate, morality, virtue triumphing, a different audience than Saikaku's floating world tales.
Poetry debates continued. Traditionalists versus those expressing personal feelings, like the priest Ryokan or the merchant Okumako Tomichi.
Right, using poetry for real experience.
And education spread beyond samurai through Shinjuku private schools.
Significantly, mostly Confucian, but some Kokugaku schools too. Hirose Tanso's Kangin in Kyushu is a great example. Thousands of students over decades, mixed backgrounds, doctors, merchants, farmers, artisans, priests, focused on classics but also practical careers.
So Rangaku acceptance grew, but often filtered through Confucianism.
Yes, that's a key point. Texts sometimes read in Chinese. Scholars often train as Confucians first, interpreting European knowledge through that lens, presenting it as compatible with Tokugawa thought.
Early interest was strong among interpreters in Nagasaki, doctors in Edo, Sugita Genpaku.
Right, a daimyo physician. He pushed Rangaku, but framed it cleverly using Confucian terms. Argued the way wasn't just China's, but universal way of heaven and earth, making new learning acceptable.
Meanwhile, in rural areas, Ninomiya Santoku taught Hotoku, returning one's blessings.
Yeah. Existence imposes moral burdens, repay them through hard work, brings prosperity, asserted the virtue of all workers, especially peasants.
Like the Kaitakuta scholars did for merchants, Santoku asserted peasant dignity, but within the existing order.
Exactly. Advocated industrious participation. Landlords and rulers loved it. His views might have faded if not promoted later for political ends.
Religion also offered renewal. Festivals, Matsuri, got bigger despite official calls for frugality.
Yeah, offered revitalization. Pilgrimages, too, especially to ice, became hugely popular, a break from routine. Authorities discouraged travel,
But locals often welcomed pilgrims, free food and lodging.
partly to avoid trouble, partly hoping for religious benefits. Maybe the pilgrim was a holy figure in disguise. Kindness brings good fortune.
And new religious groups emerged from hardship in the 19th century, like Kurozumi Mudetara.
Yes, a Pure Land priest. Illness, kami possession, recovery, devoted to Amaterasu as a living kami, preached health through devotion, aligning with the kami's will, led to the Kurozumi sect.
And Kawari Bunjiro, poor farmer, hardship, blamed a demonic kami, Kanjin.
Right. Illness, possession, devoted himself to Kanjin. Another possession became a living kami. Quit farming, recognized as a Shinto priest. His teaching spread, became the Kanko sect.
Shows how personal suffering could drive new spiritual movements outside official channels.
Definitely. And alongside this, you see critiques of the status quo emerging in scholarly circles. Namiki Risui complains scholars wanted to be heroes, not sikshas, leading to bad behavior, heretical doctrines.
Criticizing figures like Rai Sanyo for promoting heroics.
Seems so. And the Mido school, famous for its historical project on the emperors, became more politically active. Their status as a Seng, a main Tokugawa branch family, gave them weight.
A key figure, Aizawa Seishisai and his Shinran, New Theses from 1825, strong nativist, anti-foreign message.
Very. But also this idea of godly responsibility for the nation's well-being, holding rulers accountable. Legitimacy depends on performance. Fail, and you deserve to be replaced.
Shinran diagnosed problems.
Yeah.
Moral decay, weak defense, foreign threats.
Yeah. Prescriptions, spiritual unity, internal reforms, coastal defense, military strengthening, reviving virtues, crucially, straighten the country within first.
His goal was even global. Rescue the world from suffering, eliminate Western religions.
Ambitious stuff.
Yeah.
And the source notes he strategically waved the bloody shirt of a Russian menace to make his case stronger.
And Mido's status, especially under Nariaki as I was lord, gave this activism real political clout.
Absolutely. It wasn't just abstract theory.
So the source sees a big shift in thought, 1790-1850, from quarrels to angry denunciations and visionary rhetoric.
Yeah, a real intensification.
Yeah.
More ideas, more schemes floating around. Tied to societal changes, rural hardship causing disillusionment, Wider schooling, broadening horizons, domestic and foreign problems, shaking old beliefs, forcing people to think anew.
All these currents, discontent, new ideas bring us to part 5. Cracks widen. The end approaches.
Mm,
Mid-19th century. Internal problems meet escalating external pressure.
right. Topman notes political stresses intensified. Bakufu and daimyo leaders demanded more from vassals while cutting their stipends. Bad combo.
Pressure for ideological conformity increased, punishing thinkers.
Yeah, heightened tension between rulers, vassals, and intellectuals. Some officials just opted out, became bunjin, others pursued reformist ideas. Rage over the Tenpo famine even led to coup attempts.
Samurai disillusionment grew, especially as foreigners started showing up more forcefully from the 1850s.
Exactly. Foreign pressure mounted significantly. Even though visits were sparse between 1826-1850, that rising ethnic self-awareness from Kokugaku and Mitogaku was brewing. It created a more hostile, intellectually grounded response when the threat really returned.
The spy crisis of 1828 foreshadowed this. Siebold getting maps from Takahashi.
Yeah, Siebold, the Dutch physician, got classified stuff, discovered accidentally when his ship was beached. Siebold held a year, Takahashi and dozens arrested, seen as a major spy case, reinforcing fears.
Then debate over the Uchiharai Law, drive away foreign ships. The Morrison incident in 1837, firing on a ship.
Right. And the Dutch later reported, 1842, the British were still angry, might seek redress, maybe even war, caused real alarm in Edo.
Led them to slightly soften the policy, provide aid if shipwrecked.
Yes, a small but significant shift from just driving them off indiscriminately.
More formal contact attempts followed. The Dutch king's letter in 1844 warning about Britain, suggesting accommodation.
Yeah. But Edo was divided, wary, saw it as maybe a Dutch ploy. Then French and American warships arrived in 1846, specifically asking for formal relations. The pressure was building.
And these external pressures just made internal political struggles worse. Factional feuding, Soto, was common.
Very. Within domains, within the Bakufu, sometimes violent, often contained to avoid the domain being dissolved. But governing involved tough choices, and failures or corruption gave rivals openings.
The source uses Tenoma Ukitsugu as an example. Rose high, gained huge influence.
Immense power, wealth, packed the government with allies, even influenced the choice of the shogun's heir.
But rivals organized, seized a chance when the shogun got sick.
Exactly. Rumors of poisoning. They moved quickly, halted his schemes, kicked out his officials, forced his resignation. Shows how quickly fortunes could turn.
Then Mizuno Tadakuni's Tenpo reforms from 1841, another big attempt to fix things. He wasn't against Mito's reform ideas.
Not fundamentally, the source says, but Nariaki from Mito offered unsolicited advice, which offended Tadakuni, who sent him packing for 5 years.
Then Tadakuni issued tons of edicts, trying everything.
Pretty much. Samurai rededication, daimyo follow rules, break monopolies, improve morals, cut luxury, boost rice reserves, lower prices, send migrants back to villages, employ the poor, restore status distinctions.
Wow, a real scattergun approach. Manipulated currency, got money from merchants.
Tried it all, but ultimately it didn't stick. The problems were too deep.
Coastal defense became critical, managed by both local domains, Han and the Bakufu, both short on cash.
Right. Daimyo started strengthening defenses, especially in Kyushu, wealthier, more autonomous, closer to Nagasaki and the perceived threat.
Satsuma, for instance, boosted its military from the late 1830s, trying European weapons.
Yeah, adopting techniques from Dutch studies, scholars trying to buy or make European cannons and guns.
Abe Masahiro becomes Bakufu leader in 1845. Initially allied with Nariaki's enemies, but realized he needed Nariaki for defense advice.
Yes, a difficult relationship. Nariaki was relentlessly critical of Bakufu, ignoring Sank opinions, foreign policy failures, handling castaways. The King William led a response.
Nariaki pushed hard for restoring the Uchiharai Law, building ships, casting cannon, fortifying Hokkaido.
Absolutely. He was a major voice for strengthening Japan militarily and rejecting foreign demands.
These debates just escalated with more foreign demands, like Perry's arrival, leading eventually to Tea Naosuke trying to assert Bakufu control.
Exactly. An attempt at forceful centralization and managing foreign relations on Bakufu terms.
But even that collapsed when Tea Naosuke was assassinated in 1860 by samurai from Mito.
Yes, the irony. Assassinated by samurai from the very domain whose lord, Nariaki, though confined then, had been a leading advocate for national strengthening. Shows how volatile things were.
The years after that, 1860 to 1864, marked by confusion, the Kobugatai strategy union of court and camp.
Yeah, an attempt by senior figures to reconcile the imperial court and the Bakufu daimyo. but it was fundamentally flawed.
How so?
Tension between reinforcing Bakufu supremacy versus powerful daimyo like Satsuma and Choshu, using it to push for their dominance. Same words, conflicting goals.
So Kobugate collapsed by 1864, and exclusivism driving out foreigners took over briefly.
Among certain groups, yeah. Culminating in the final showdown between the Bakufu and Ki domains, mainly Satsuma and Choshu, Satcho.
Most other daimyos stayed out until the winter was clear.
Pretty much. Satcho won, the Meiji leaders emerged, dismantled the old system, built a new one.
Their survival wasn't just skill, but also because nobody really wanted the old system back by then.
That's what Topman suggests. By 1868, few thought the Bakuhan system was viable. Discontent was fragmented.
And a key factor in navigating this and avoiding foreign domination was the short civil war and nativist ideology.
Absolutely. Gogugaku, which had become more political and ethnic, provided a powerful, widely accepted rationale for acting against the foreign threat.
The idea of Japan as the special land of the gods mobilized support across classes and domains.
Incredibly effective. By the mid-1860s, leaders on all sides were using this nativist rhetoric, and the new Meiji regime just absorbed it into its official ideology. A powerful story for national unity facing the outside world.
So it was this perfect storm. Deep internal pressures, rising external threats, and this powerful unifying ideology that fueled the final collapse and the transformation.
That's the complex picture Topman paints, yeah. All these factors coming together.
Wow, that really was a deep dive.
Yeah.
We've covered centuries of incredible change and complexity. Seeing Japan go from that fractured, warring land to a unified, peaceful, but yet incredibly regulated society under the Tokugawa.
We really explored how leaders used, well, everything. Brutal force, clever politics, economic strategies, social control to build and keep that state going for over 200 years.
And we saw how people within that system adapted. They found ways to create vibrant culture like the urban ukiyo, develop new religious movements, wrestle with new ideas, sometimes even questioning the whole basis of their society.
And we detailed those growing stresses from within the environmental pressures, from pushing resources too hard, the fiscal problems, the social tensions building up over time.
And finally, how that increasing pressure from foreign powers in the 19th century really acted as a catalyst, making those internal issues boil over, leading to the breakdown and collapse of the Tokugawa Bakufu.
And as you've heard, this whole intricate story, all the specific examples, the key figures, the cultural shifts, the environmental challenges, came right out of our source material, Topman's book. It really shows how much depth you can get from carefully reading historical texts.
Hopefully this deep dive has given you, our listeners, a much richer understanding of early modern Japan. Not just, dates and names, but a real sense of the dynamic interplay between power, people, culture, the economy, and even the environment that shaped this absolutely pivotal era.
And as we finish up, here's maybe a final thought to leave you with. The Tokugawa shogunate's main goal, its reason for being, was stability, preventing that return to chaos, maintaining control above all else. They built an incredibly long-lasting system to do just that.
But was it those very efforts to achieve stasis, to resist change, to keep everything locked down, combined with those unavoidable internal problems and external pressures, that ultimately made the system too rigid, too inflexible to survive a world that was changing around it?
What can we learn today from Japan's centuries-long experiment in trying to, in effect, stand still? And what happened when it finally couldn't anymore? Something to think about.